What's up, y'all? Roy here, and you're listening to the Clemens with a Z podcast. I've been thinking a lot about faith lately, about what it builds, what it destroys, and why empathy and compassion seem to be at the center of so many debates. Why do these things that should be so basic to our humanity feel like battlegrounds? And the more I look at the way people talk about all this today, especially the way they talk about empathy, compassion, those who deserve it, the more I see one thing driving it all: fear. Doesn't seem like it's a faith that's built on love. It's not a faith rooted in the vastness of God and the deep and difficult beauty of life's biggest questions. No, it's a faith rooted in fear. Fear of getting it wrong, fear of stepping outside the lines, fear of losing control. And faith that starts in fear can lead only to one thing: control. Because when people are afraid of the unknown, when they're afraid of the complexity, when they're afraid of things that don't fit neatly into their worldview, they do the one thing, the only thing that makes them feel safe. They wall it off. They define their faith by what they're against instead of what they're for. They tighten their grip, convinced that if they just hold on hard enough, if they just keep the right people in and the wrong people out, then maybe, just maybe, they'll feel safe. But to me, that's not faith. To me, that's fear pretending to be faith. And when fear is the foundation, love becomes the casualty. Compassion becomes conditional. Empathy becomes dangerous. And suddenly, what was meant to draw us closer to God and to each other becomes the very thing that separates us. And if that's what faith is doing, if it's building walls instead of bridges, if it's making us less willing to see the humanity in people, if it's causing us to step over the suffering in front of us, then I have to ask, is that God? Is that faith? And if it is it even worth following? And in a lot of ways, that's why I stopped doing messages like this. I don't know if you remember, but last year I used to call them communion messages. I'd take a moment each week to pause, reflect, and to speak. And I stopped. Maybe it's because I got too busy. Part of it's probably I let my insecurities creep in, questioning who I am to be a mouthpiece on this. Do my words matter? Things like that. But I do realize that I do need this space, not just because I want to speak, but because I want to take time to think, to process, and to sit with these big questions. What does all of this mean? What do I believe now? And I always wonder, am I the only one wrestling with this? Or are there others who feel this same tension, who see the way faith is being used to build walls instead of bridges and wonder, is this really what it's supposed to be? And so today I want to talk about empathy today, because the more I look at this conversation, this idea of quote unquote toxic empathy, this idea of caring too much is somehow dangerous, the more I see that empathy isn't the enemy. Empathy, I believe, is the foundation of human connection. I believe that compassion isn't a burden. It's the only thing that has ever driven real change. So why are so many people afraid of it? I've seen it in churches and sermons, seen it on Instagram, in the way that people talk about faith. There's this hesitation, this fear of empathy, this idea that caring too much is dangerous and wrong. And it's not just one conversation. It's not just one church. It's a pattern, a posture, a way of thinking that continues to show up again and again. And the more I see it, the more I have to ask why. Why is empathy treated like a burden? Why is compassion seen as a weakness instead of a calling? So empathy, compassion, these words get thrown around a whole lot. Have we really ever stopped to ask, why do they even matter? Why should we care about empathy at all? Why is compassion something we're even debating? I want to start with empathy. So at its core, I believe that empathy is is the glue of human relationships. It allows us to connect, to understand, to build something deeper than just transactions. Without it, we're just these isolated individuals operating in our own self-interest, never really seeing each other. And if that sounds bleak, well, it is. Because the absence of empathy isn't just an abstract issue. I believe it leads to loneliness, to division, to entire systems designed to keep people apart rather than bring them together. But I don't believe it's just this nice idea. I believe that empathy is wired into us. Some argue that it's an evolutionary trait, something that helped early human societies to survive. Because cooperation, mutual care, looking out for each other, those are just those are the things that build strong communities, right? And it's not just science that tells us this. Almost every religion and philosophy places empathy at the center of human responsibility. The golden rule, the Good Samaritan, even that idea of Ubuntu, I am because we are. They're not new concepts, they're foundational. And then there's emotional intelligence. The people who thrive in life, in relationships, even in leadership, are often the ones who understand and connect with others. The ones who know how to step outside of themselves and really listen. So, if empathy is such a core part of who we are, biologically, socially, and even spiritually, then why does it feel like it's constantly under attack? And so, compassion. If empathy is about understanding someone's pain, then compassion is what moves us to do something about it. It's empathy in action, right? And that's an important distinction because feeling something isn't enough. It matters how we respond. So think about the Good Samaritan. He didn't just feel bad for the wounded man on the side of the road. He didn't just stop, shake his head, and say, "Man, that's rough." No, he did something. He bandaged his wounds. He got him to safety. And there's the part that often gets overlooked. He helped with boundaries. He didn't adopt the man. He didn't take on his entire life burdens, but he did what he could in a way that was wise and sustainable. And I think this is what compassion is supposed to look like. It's not about martyrdom. It's not about us taking on suffering to the point of collapse. It's about seeing pain and making a choice to show up, to care, to act. That's why compassion is at the heart of every major movement for justice and social change. It's what fuels people to fight for a better world, to challenge systems that harm, to advocate for those whose voices are ignored. It's the force that turns empathy into something tangible. But not everyone is on board with this. And so, if empathy and compassion are so vital, why do they feel like battlegrounds? Why are we having conversations and books written about whether empathy is toxic? Why do we live in a time where compassion itself is seen as something that needs to be managed? I think part of it comes down to fear, because empathy requires vulnerability, and that's really uncomfortable. It asks us to step outside of our carefully constructed walls and actually feel something. And in a world that values control, detachment, and dominance, that can be seen as a weakness. That's why you hear these hyper-masculine voices dismissing empathy. That's why there's these certain influencers trying to reframe it as a liability. And it's been weaponized. This empathy has been weaponized in political and social and religious discourse. In some circles, showing empathy for one group is seen as a betrayal of another. If you care about refugees, you must not care about your people. If you stand with marginalized communities, you must be against the majority. Empathy gets distorted into this like zero-sum game where caring about one thing automatically means rejecting something else. And let's not forget burnout, especially for caregivers, social workers, educators, people who live in service of others. Empathy can be exhausting. Compassion fatigue is for real. It's a part of the reason, too, why people are wary of how much emotional labor they should take on. I know I felt this as an elementary school teacher and working with kids for as long as I had. But the answer isn't to abandon it. I think it's to practice it with boundaries, just like the Good Samaritan did. And finally, I think we have to talk about capitalism and individualism. We're in this world where success is measured by output, where productivity is king. Empathy can feel like disruption if you actually stop to care. If you take the time to understand someone's pain, it slows things down. It forces you to reconsider priorities. And in a system that thrives on efficiency over humanity, that's inconvenient. So, why empathy? Why compassion? Because without them, what's left? A world where we only look to ourselves or look out for ourselves? A society where suffering is ignored because it's not our problem? A culture where the strong survive, where the weak are cast aside? A world where because they don't look, act, talk like me, I shouldn't care? That's not a world I want to live in. And I don't think that's the world Jesus modeled either. So when we hear people dismiss empathy as toxic, when we see churches hesitate to embrace compassion fully, when we find ourselves questioning whether it's even worth it to care, that's when we have to remind ourselves what's at stake. Empathy isn't the enemy. It's the foundation of human connection. Compassion isn't a burden. It's the only thing that has ever driven real change. And if following Jesus means following his way, then it means choosing empathy. It means choosing compassion, choosing to care, even when it's inconvenient, even when it costs something. Because if we don't, then what are we even doing? So I want to take some time and talk about the people who are pushing this toxic empathy narrative. Because when you start paying attention, or when I started to pay attention, I noticed a pattern. On one side, you have these nice white women. You know the type. Soft, polished, perfectly curated. They speak in these calming tones about boundaries and self-care. They write Instagram captions about protecting your energy and not taking on other people's emotion. And sure, some of that is valid, but if you scratch just a little beneath the surface, what else are they really saying? And I also forget to mention, they talk about God's love isn't affirming. God's Jesus and God wouldn't love these certain communities. But when they're talking about toxic empathy, what they aren't talking about are caregivers or activists or people working in the trenches of real suffering. No, their version of toxic empathy seems to be distancing themselves from discomfort, about making sure they don't have to feel too much for others, and to not believe the people that they're against. And let's be honest, most of these women can afford that distance. They have the privilege of choosing when and where they engage. Their empathy is an aesthetic, a vibe, something to sprinkle into their brand, not real, not lived necessity. And on the other side, you have the pseudo quote unquote alpha males, the ones who scoff at feelings, who talk about Jesus needing to be strong and Jesus wouldn't empathize with all these other types of people because of their beliefs on what sin is and what a sinful life can be. They talk about empathy makes you feel weak. They'll call it an emotional burden or even a feminine energy. They'll tell you that caring too much is why men are struggling, why society is soft. But of course, their emotions, their rage, their frustration, their need for control, those are completely justified. It's only empathy, only care for others that's seen as excess baggage. But here's the kicker. Both of these groups, these nice white women, these alpha male caricature preachers, they aren't actually that different. They're two sides of the same coin. Both are promoting detachment. Both are selling the idea that empathy is dangerous, inconvenient, something to be avoided. And both are coming from places where they can afford to disengage. And it's hard for me because I see why people are drawn to them. I can see how they connect with people's fears, their insecurities, the deep discomfort of living in a world that is constantly demanding more of them or is constantly changing and doesn't look like what they thought it looked like. These voices offer a kind of relief, a justification for pulling away. And for a lot of people, that's really seductive. Because at the heart of all this is something even bigger. The idea that religion, faith, God should look and sound just like you. That God should affirm your comfort, your worldview, your priorities. And there's that word, affirming. It gets thrown around a ton. Some people hear it and immediately bristle. They think affirmation means surrender, as if to acknowledge someone's humanity is the same as endorsing every decision they make. That's not what empathy does. That's not what compassion does. Seeing someone, understanding their struggle, stepping into their pain for a moment, that's not affirmation. That's humanity. And of course, right alongside this fear of being too affirming is the fear of not protecting our borders, physically, emotionally, spiritually. There's this deeply ingrained belief that compassion, if left unchecked, will lead to chaos. That if we're too open, too caring, too willing to listen, then we'll lose something, our identity, our security, or our sense of control. But Jesus never set up borders around compassion. He never checked someone's papers before healing them. He never asked if someone was worthy before feeding them. And yet, here we are in a world where people talk about empathy like it's a threat to be managed, rather than the thing that holds us all together. So I have to ask, why are they the ones getting to define what empathy looks like? Why are the voices with the most privilege, the most comfort, the least proximity to any real suffering, are the ones shaping this conversation? And why are so many people listening? And that's what I keep coming back to. If faith is supposed to be about truth, why does it so often become about control instead? For me, as long as I've read the Bible, even today, empathy and compassion have always been at the core of it. I don't know how to see it any other way. And that's why it's always been so uncomfortable for me to hear people talk about faith in terms of these rigid walls, strict boundaries, and this obsession with us versus them. Because that kind of thinking, that kind of dualistic black and white in or out mindset, it never brought me closer to God. It didn't make me a better person. It didn't make me feel whole. If anything, it led me down dark paths. It made me feel anxious, afraid, disconnected. It was convincing me that faith was about control and about getting it all right, about making sure I was on the right side of the line. And that way of thinking caused me real harm. And I know it causes a lot of people real harm as well. And when I look back at my life, I don't see rigid theology. I see people. I can see people who showed me something different. People who, whether they realize it or not, embodied Jesus' compassion toward me. People who didn't make love conditional, who didn't make faith about fear. And because of them, I can't get behind this toxic way of looking at the Bible. Because when I see Jesus, I see a man who sat with people everyone else avoided. I see a man who refused to pick a side when people demanded it. I see someone who challenged the powerful but never turned away the vulnerable. And if that's who Jesus is, then why would I follow any version of faith that tells me to do the opposite? And I want to get back to this idea of faith built on fear, because that type of faith will always lead to control. Because fear makes people desperate for certainty. It makes them afraid of nuances, the complexities, the unanswered questions, the paradoxes. And when faith becomes about eliminating uncertainty instead of embracing it, people start reaching for easy, simple solutions, answers that fit neatly into their worldview, that don't stretch them and don't challenge them. You see this in the news, you see it on social media, you see it everywhere. And in that space is when the walls start going up. That's when people start shutting out anything or anyone that doesn't fit. Because when faith is about control instead of truth, it stops being about seeking and starts being about protecting. Protecting a belief system, protecting an identity, protecting a version of God but never asks too much of them. But here's the thing. If your faith never unsettles you, never stretches you, never leads you into deeper, harder, more complicated questions, then is that faith? Or is it just fear dressed up as certainty? Because I see it all the time. People don't want a God who pushes them toward mystery, who forces them to sit with the unknown, who invites them into a faith that is bigger than their understanding. They want a God who looks like them, thinks like them, and agrees with them. They want a faith that reinforces their comfort, not one that draws them deeper into the unknown. The God I see in Scripture, the Jesus I see in the Gospels, they never offered easy answers. They never simplified the hard questions just to make people feel safe. They challenged people. They made them uncomfortable. They refused to let faith or refused to reduce faith to a system that they could control. And I have to wonder, if the faith you're following is built around certainty, around never having to wrestle, around making sure that your God never disagrees with you, then is that really faith? Or is it just another way of making the world small enough to manage? So let's go to the parable of the Good Samaritan, Luke 10, verses 29 to 37. Now, I bring this up. I brought this up on the podcast before, but I want to talk about this idea of the teaching of Jesus in this parable form. Because what I see in this conversation, these people talking about toxic empathy, is they feel like they're following the rule, following the law, following God, following faith, and their critiques or their boundaries are right. They feel right in the system. Okay? It's based on their belief. So I want to talk about two of the characters in the Good Samaritan. You have the priest and the Levite. Now, I'm not going to read the story of the Good Samaritan right now. And I recommend you all reading that. I know probably most of you listening have probably read it before. But it's easy to paint these two as villains in this story. We can say things like, look at these heartless religious leaders who ignored a dying man. But if we step into their world for a moment, things are going to get complicated. Because the priest and the Levite weren't just avoiding the man out of cruelty. They were following the religious laws of their time. According to Jewish purity laws, touching a dead body or even a severely wounded one could make them ritually unclean. For a priest, that wasn't a small thing. It meant being unable to perform temple duties. It meant social and religious consequences. The Levite, too, had obligations tied to a religious service, and getting involved in this situation would have been costly. So in their minds, their decision wasn't random, it was intentional. And there's an intentionality in the parables that are wild to see, okay? Because to them, what they were doing was lawful. It was justified. And that's where things get uncomfortable because they did what was right by their religious rules. But we can look at it as wrong by the standard of compassion. And isn't that the tension we see today? Well, often do people, especially religious leaders, especially religious social influencers, which is weird that we have that now. Whatever. Maybe I'm that. Am I that? I don't know. Let me know in the comments if you think I'm that. No, it makes me feel weird, but whatever. They justify inaction because of rules, policies, and doctrine. How often is empathy sacrificed on the altar of doing things the quote unquote right way? Because that, to me, is the real challenge of this parable. The priest and Levite weren't evil. They were just following a system. But what I believe Jesus was showing in this parable, the authors of this parable, that sometimes the system itself is flawed. Sometimes the rules we cling to prevent us from actually seeing the suffering right in front of us and doing something about it. And then, of course, you have the Samaritan, the outsider. The Samaritan was the one who had every religious and cultural reason not to help. And yet, he's the one who stops. He's the one who chooses mercy over legality, action, and detachment. And what I see in this parable is that it's not about flipping the script here. They want to burn the whole script and hand us a new one. So when we talk about empathy today, when we hear people labeling it as toxic or unwise, we have to ask, are we just doing what feels lawful, what feels acceptable? Are we following a system that tells us to keep walking? Or are we willing to stop, to see, to actually do something? And then as I continue thinking about this, and I've been pondering and meditating on all of this, I come back to this question that I asked. It was back in episode 93. Who is your Samaritan? Because I think that if Jesus was here and telling this story today, who would he put in that role of the Samaritan? Who is that person that would make people in power uncomfortable? Who is the one that religious institutions hesitate to acknowledge as fully human? Who is that? Who is the one that if Jesus made them the hero of the story, we would instinctively recoil the thought? Would it be an immigrant at the border, risking everything for a chance at life? Would it be a Muslim refugee, fleeing war and seeking safety? Would it be a member of the LGBTQIA plus community, someone who's been told over and over again that they don't belong? Would it be a trans person? Would it be a political opponent, the very person you've been conditioned to see as the enemy? Because if the story of the Good Samaritan teaches us anything, it's that Jesus isn't interested in who we think is worthy. He isn't interested in our social categories, our purity tests, or the walls we've built to keep our kind separate from them. He takes the very person the religious establishment despised and makes them the example of what love looks like, forcing the audience to see holiness in the one they least expected. So what if that's what's still being done today? What if the people we've been told to fear, to avoid, to write off as sinful, dangerous, or unworthy, what if they're the ones showing the kind of compassion, mercy, and humanity that we need to be learning from? What if the very people churches refuse to embrace are the ones embodying the heart of Jesus more than the people inside the church walls? So let's go back to Jesus. Specifically, the way churches proclaim him as king, the ultimate authority, the ruler of law. They sing about it, preach about it, build entire theological frameworks around his kingship. And yet, when it comes to following his actual example, when it comes to embodying the thing that defines so much of his ministry, radical boundary breaking compassion, they hesitate. They outright reject it. Because Jesus wasn't just compassionate in theory. He didn't just say, love your neighbor and leave it at that. He lived it. He touched lepers when no one else would. He fed people who were hungry. He wept with those who were grieving, broke religious and social barriers to show love to those who had been cast aside. And yet, in so many of these modern churches, empathy is treated like a liability. It's discouraged, it's seen as weakness and wrong, and label it toxic empathy. But the irony about this, these same churches, the ones that diminish empathy, love to exalt Jesus as king, sing the songs, right? Put it on a t-shirt. And if Jesus is truly their king, wouldn't that mean following his way? Because when you actually look at his life, his kingship wasn't about dominance. It wasn't about sitting on some throne while people bowed before him. Kingship to Jesus was defined by servanthood, by sacrifice, by, dare I say it, compassion. The very thing that's being dismissed today. Like the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's a simple story, right? A man beaten, left for dead on the side of the road. A priest walks by, see him, does nothing. A Levite, another religious leader, also passes by. Maybe they're busy. Maybe they had theological justifications for why they shouldn't get involved. Maybe they feared what helping would cost them. Does this sound familiar? But then comes the Samaritan, the outsider, the one who had every reason not to help, and he stops. He tends to the man's wounds, makes sure he's taken care of. He doesn't just feel bad for him, he acts. That's the kind of empathy Jesus in the Bible, what we read or quote unquote want to follow, calls us to do. So why is it that so many churches act today more like the priest and the Levite than the Samaritan? Why is there such a fear of real, engaged compassion? Is it because true empathy demands something from us that is inconvenient, but it challenges power structures? Because let's be real. Because if these churches truly took Jesus' example of radical empathy seriously, it would force them to confront the ways they've failed. It would mean questioning who they've neglected, who they'd excluded, and who they've justified walking past on the side of the road. So if Jesus is king, okay, then shouldn't his way be the way? And his way, not about control, not about hierarchy, not about distancing yourself from the pain of others, protect your own comfort, about presence, about care, about action. And if modern churches struggle with that, then maybe the real question isn't whether empathy is toxic. Maybe the real question is whether they're actually following the king they claim to serve. And so the thing I keep coming back to is that Jesus wasn't really telling people what to believe. He wasn't just handing them a rule book. He told stories, stories that had weight, stories that made people think. And the parable of the Good Samaritan wasn't just setting a new standard for how to behave. It was about pointing to something deeper, the state of people's hearts. Because look at how the conversation starts. The man asks Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" And Jesus doesn't answer him directly. He doesn't say, "Your neighbor is everyone, now go and do accordingly." Instead, he tells a story that forces the listener to engage, to place themselves in it, to wrestle with what it means. And at the end of it, Jesus turns the question back on them. Who was a neighbor to the man? He makes them say it. He makes them confront it within themselves. He doesn't just dictate the answer, he draws it out of them. And that's what I think all of this is supposed to do. Faith, God, the Bible. It's not just about being handed the right beliefs. It's about engaging with something that unsettles you, that challenges your assumptions, that makes you search your own heart and mind to ask, what does this mean for me? And not be afraid of where that leads you. And when I look at the way people are talking about empathy today, how they're trying to frame it as toxic, as dangerous, as something that needs to be managed, I have to wonder, is it really coming from a place of searching, or is it an attempt to avoid the work of looking inward? Ooh. Because that's the real power of this parable. It doesn't let you off the hook. It doesn't let you intellectualize your way around it or hide behind a theological excuse. It puts you in the story and asks, what do you see? What do you feel? What are you going to do about it? And I want to be clear about something. Questioning all of this, wrestling with it, whatever side you're on, wherever you're at with this, it's not a weakness. It's not a lack of faith. If anything, I think it might be the most faithful thing we can do. Because I don't think faith was ever supposed to be a script that we just recite without thinking. I don't think it was never supposed to be something we follow blindly, never asking why. But what I keep seeing, the thing that makes all of this so heavy, is that the answers people are giving to these questions don't seem to come from a place of wisdom, love, or deep conviction. It all comes from fear. fear of being wrong, fear of losing power, fear of losing identity, fear of opening the door too wide and letting in someone, something that challenges the way things always have been. And that fear creates this kind of tribalism. It doesn't just divide people, it damages them. It convinces people that faith is about choosing sides instead of seeking truth. It tells them that the empathy is dangerous, that compassion has limits, that loving too much means betraying something or someone. But here's the thing: when fear is the foundation, when tribalism is the lens, we all lose. Everyone. The people inside the tribe live in constant suspicion, always guarding the walls, always make sure no one gets too freaking close. And the people outside the tribe are left to fend for themselves. They're demonized. They're dehumanized, turned into them instead of us. And in all of it, we lose the thing that actually makes faith matter: the ability to see God in each other, the ability to see that divine spark that's in all of us, the ability to see each of us and them. So, yeah, wrestle, ask the hard questions, push back, pay attention to the answers that you're given. If they're rooted in fear, exclusion, drawing lines instead of opening doors, maybe they're not the answers at all. Maybe they're just defenses. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what Jesus came to break down. So all of this, the Good Samaritan, the fear of empathy, the voices that trying to redefine compassion, it leads me to this one question. If following your religion, your faith, builds walls instead of bridges, if it drives you deeper into tribal mentality, if it turns everything into an us versus them scenario, if it makes it harder to see the humanity in everyone, is it God? If it makes you more closed off, more suspicious, more unwilling to listen, is it really faith? If it convinces you that you're always on the side of righteousness and everyone else is wrong, lost, or dangerous, then what are you exactly worshiping? Because that doesn't look like Jesus. That doesn't sound like the God who told a story of the hero was the very person his audience despised. That doesn't sound like someone who broke bread with sinners, who touched lepers, who told Peter to put away his sword instead of fighting his enemies. So if your faith is making you less empathetic, less willing to care, less willing to see the image of God, the divine spark in people who don't look like you, live like you, believe like you, talk like you, then maybe it's not faith. It's fear. It's power. It's a version of God that we've created in our own image that affirms our comfort and justifies our detachment. And yeah, that's a hard thing to wrestle with, but it's a necessary thing to do. Because if we don't ask these questions, we risk becoming the priest and the Levite, the people who believe they're serving God while stepping over the people who need them the most. And I'm wrapping this up, I promise. But I couldn't not talk about this. So now think about this. Who is that person that if Jesus told you the story right now would make you uncomfortable as the hero? Would it be the immigrant, the Muslim refugee, LGBTQIA plus individual, the trans person, the political opponent? Because again, that's what this parable was about. Not letting you off the hook. It's forcing you to ask, if Jesus told the story today, would I even recognize the Samaritan? And if I wouldn't, if my first reaction is to resist the idea, to argue, to explain why it's different, And maybe it says more about me than anything else. So are you following a faith that makes you less willing to love? Are you choosing safety over compassion? Are you willing to see God in the people that you've been taught to avoid? And if not, why? And so my final thought with all this is when I look around, the more and more I do it, the more and more I see of what we don't need, that what we don't need is more fear, more division, more reasons to keep each other at a distance. What we do need desperately is more compassion, more empathy, more understanding, more connections. Because at the end of the day, we're really not that different from each other. Not really, not in the ways that actually matter. And if faith is supposed to mean anything, if it's supposed to bring us closer to the truth, to each other, to God, then shouldn't it make us more willing to see each other, to listen, to love? So I'll ask it again. Who is the Samaritan today for you? And more importantly, are we willing to recognize them? Because it's one thing to think about who the Samaritan is. It's another thing to decide what you're going to do about it. So thank you for tuning into this episode with Clemens with a Z. Your support means the world to me and helps keep these conversations going. If you've ever wrestled with these questions about faith, empathy, and what it means to follow Jesus, I see you. These conversations aren't always easy, but I believe they matter. And if this episode made you think, challenged you, or maybe even unsettled you a bit, I'd encourage you to sit with that, wrestle with it, and ask yourself, who is the Samaritan today? And what does that mean to me? I'd also love to hear from you. Again, if you're a member or know someone who is a part of the ICOC or the ICC and would like to share your story about life in and out of the church, I'd love to hear from you. Together, we can keep exploring the question, we were in a cult, and perhaps find some healing along the way. If you're a dad, want to come on a dad talk, I'd love to hear you. If just a person that wants to come on and talk, share your story, let's do it. You can reach me via email at clemenswithaz@gmail.com or send me a DM on the Instagram or on Instagram at the Clemens with a Z podcast page. As always, if you enjoyed the podcast, please rate, review, like, and subscribe. It helps more people find these stories. Don't forget, just a channel. I ain't the source. If you'd like to support the podcast financially, you can find the link to the GoFundMe in the show notes or on the Clemens with a Z Instagram page. And until next time, take care of yourself, stay open, stay connected, and don't be afraid to ask the hard questions. Peace.